In the previous couple of lectures, we have looked at how far James I could be held responsible for the outbreak of civil conflict in the 1640s. Whatever your conclusion, we can all agree that James's actions and legacy were a precondition. What we need to review and look at now is the person most likely to be the trigger for conflict, King Charles I himself. Charles was James's second son, born in Scotland in 1600. James therefore had the heir and a spare. As a child, Charles suffered from weak ankle joints, slowing his physical development. He was also slow in learning to speak and never overcame his stammer. Nevertheless, he was a serious-minded student who was excellent at languages, rhetoric and theology. However, in 1612, Charles became the heir to the throne of the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland when his older brother Henry died of typhoid. Taught by his father in all aspects of ruling, Charles ascended to the throne in 1625. The intention of this lecture and the associated materials is to conclude the investigation into the longer-term causes of the Civil War. For you, in regards to your knowledge, is to start learning and using the key terms and definitions needed in this component, with reference to skills, to consider via analysis and evaluation how power was distributed within Stuart Britain. Then finally, behaviourally, you will start to make the revision aids you will need for your final exams at the end of year 13. When Charles became king in March 1625, he inherited from his father a war with Spain, which Charles was left to declare. The war with Spain was part of the wider 30 Years' Wars and wars of religion in Europe. The war with Spain was also conducted mainly by George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, a close friend to Charles and lover to the late King James. This close relationship was a wedge between Crown and Parliament. Also, massive debt and lack of funds for the Crown to wage the war with Spain, which was, of course, going very badly. All of this was wrapped up with the fact that each of Charles's kingdoms was very different in nature. Though similar in many ways, both kings shared their belief in the divine right of kings. Charles and James differed in their ability to compromise. Where James sought and often found a solution, for Charles it was only his way. This attitude did not help Charles in search for funds to fight the war with Spain, as the only institution in England able to grant these funds was Parliament. The king is, of course, at the top of the power structure of Britain, sovereign and divine at the same time, ruling from the top and setting the tone and direction of the kingdoms. Beneath the king, in relation to power distribution, you have the royal court, friends, servants, advisors and office holders and members of the greater nobility. Both formal and informal, the court had access to the king and could influence his decisions. Nevertheless, for James it was mostly entertainment, and for Charles, masked balls to entertain his wife. The Privy Council, however, was the most formal institution for use of power in Stuart Britain. The king's chosen advisors, heads of departments and those he trusted to guide him in the decision-making business of running the three kingdoms. A seat on the Privy Council was a prized position. Outside of royal circles, the most important institution was that of Parliament. In some ways similar to the 21st century Parliament, it is mostly very different. It still has two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the Lords being the most powerful. Like today, in the House of Lords there were 26 bishops. However, the House of Commons, unlike today, had 2 MPs each, split on county and borough boundaries. Parliament was called, prorogued and dismissed by the King, passed laws which had to be agreed by the King. There were no political parties as you understand them, rather factional groups or juntos who had similar views or goals at that time. Parliament's role was to enact the wishes of the King. However, since the break with Rome, Parliament's power and responsibility had been growing, and they were not going to let anyone take any of that newfound power away. Common law courts included the courts of the Exchequer, the King's Bench, the Common Pleas in London. The King appointed judges. England was split into areas called assizes, and there were 2 judges on circuit in the assizes moving around dealing with cases. In between the assizes, there were 3 justices of the peace in quarter sessions. Local government enacted the wishes of Parliament. The Lord Lieutenant dealt with the calling and maintaining of local militias. There was no national army at this time, just a collection of peasants or locals. Sheriffs looked after and controlled the local jails and elections. Justices of the peace looked after the application of the law. Parish officials, such as constables, attempted to maintain the peace, and overseers of the poor laws collected the poor rates and dealt with the limited level of social control in the areas. Prerogative courts were run by Privy Councillors representing the King's authority, such as the Chancery and Star Chamber in London, or the High Commission dealing with church affairs. Regional councils, such as the North and the Welsh Marches. William Laud will sit on both Star Chamber and High Commission. These courts were run in secret, which many felt was against the rights of individual and a sign of arbitrary power of the king. The church in England was run by archbishops, so the Archbishop of Canterbury and of York. This episcopal, run by bishops, delivered the sermons during services in support of kingship and obedience of the king. Everyone had to go to church, and failure to go to a Church of England service came as serious punishment. Therefore, the church was an important instrument in the control of the people, especially as the king was God's representative on earth. Beneath this was the electorate, the gentry, the merchant elite, those middling sort. This section made up the political nation, those that took part in elections and the running of local affairs. Therefore, the people, the other 98%, were tenant farmers and labourers and had no means to have their views heard, other than by disorder. Deference was the order of the day. Charles from the start developed a hate-hate relationship with Parliament. The Mansfield campaign in 1625 was organised by Buckingham and was a massive failure, seeing defeat and loss of life. Parliament's response was an attempt to ensure funds were not squandered, such as James's failure to spend the subsidies for war in 1624 on war. They believed, therefore, that by offering tonnage and poundage, a tax on imports and exports for just a year, would mean the king would have to call Parliament each year. Charles took it as an attack on his royal power. Henrietta Maria arrived to marry Charles, a Catholic who was allowed to take Catholic Mass and hold her own royal Catholic court. Questions began to be asked about Charles's own religious persuasions. Charles was not a Catholic. However, he was not a Calvinist, and this unsettled many who sat in Parliament. Fears about Charles's religious leanings were exacerbated again when Charles promoted clergy who supported Arminian thinking. Arminianism was a Protestant faith, but followed many of the Catholic ways, falling short of recognising the Pope as the head of the Church. Actions also taken by the king during the war caused concern for Parliament, and the legality of false billeting was raised. The practice of soldiers being placed in people's homes and their upkeep being the person's responsibilities hit those in coastal towns on the south coast. In an attempt to improve Britain's placement in the war, Buckingham decided to emulate Drake's victory in 1587 by attacking Cadiz. Impeachment on Buckingham began as a result of the failed attack on Cadiz in Spain. This caused a diplomatic failure with France, the other Catholic nation, who then went out to sign a peace treaty with Spain and join them in the war against Britain. Britain by 1627 was at war with France and Spain. Due to the impeachment attempt on Buckingham, Charles dissolves Parliament twice to protect him. While Parliament is closed down, Charles decides to collect funds via a false loan, a request of the political nation to gift a sum of money to the king with no prospect of a return. In 1627, 5 knights refuse to pay the loan and are arrested and thrown into prison. Their request for habeas corpus is refused, as the king states due to the war he is using emergency powers. So, let us recap the events so far. In 1625, Henrietta Maria arrives in England with her Catholic entourage, and following the failure of the Mansfield campaign, the House of Commons refuses tonnage and poundage for life. In 1626, Buckingham leads a failed attack on Cadiz, and a soldier named John Felton is wounded. Then France declares war on Britain, following their peace with Spain. Parliament attempts to impeach Buckingham, and Charles dissolves it. Then, in 1627, needing money to wage the war, Charles issues a forced loan, and 5 knights refuse to pay it. They are arrested and refused habeas corpus. Further failures in the war against the French at La Rochelle. Moving on, in 1628, John Felton, the soldier wounded at Cadiz, assassinates Buckingham. Charles blames Parliament for this action. In the need for money, Charles agrees to the Petition of Right, never intending to follow. The petition sought recognition of 4 principles: no taxation without the consent of Parliament, no imprisonment without cause, no quartering or billeting of soldiers on subjects, and no martial law in peacetime. In 1629, hoping to reach a compromise of sorts, Charles suspended Parliament. However, members, including Denzil Hollis, held the Speaker down and passed what is known as the Free Resolutions. It denounced Arminianism and encouraged merchants to refuse to pay tonnage and poundage. Those who paid were branded enemies to the kingdom and betrayers of the liberties of England. For Charles, this was the last straw, and he issued a proclamation that he was to rule without Parliament. He then began working on peace treaties with France and Spain, signing the Treaty of Suza in 1629. The intention of this lecture and the associated materials was for you to conclude the investigation into the longer-term causes of the Civil War. In regards to your knowledge, you were to start learning and using the key terms and definitions needed in this component. With reference to skills, to consider via analysis and evaluation how power was distributed within Stuart Britain. Then finally, behaviourally, you will start to make the revision aids you will need for your final exams at the end of Year 13. Please now complete the associated materials to ensure you meet this intent.